My name is Pete Peterson. I'm the very grateful Dean of Pepperdine's Graduate School of Public Policy, and it is a delight to welcome you here to our campus in Malibu, California for the beginning of this day and a half celebration of the life and work of Ted McAllister. My relationship with Ted goes back a number of years and iterations, as I know it does for many of you. I first got to know Ted in 2005 as a 39-year-old graduate student here at the policy school. And in those first couple months as an older graduate student, I frankly wondered if I had made a good decision to drive across country from New Jersey to come to Malibu. Obviously, the weather was one thing, but to get reintegrated into an academic environment was something different. And swimming in that first semester of classes, which included statistics and microeconomics, along with a great books course that Ted taught, and Roots of American Order, which at the time was taught by the former president of Pepperdine, David Davenport, my head was totally spinning. And it really was in early October that I leaned over to my wife just to say, I just don't know if we made the right decision here. I know I dragged you across country, and while it's nice to be in Malibu in October as opposed to New Jersey, this is pretty stretching. And then we hit the point in the syllabus in great books in which we got to Tocqueville. And to be underneath Ted's teaching of Tocqueville, I just have to say, is one of life's great blessings. And it was that really couple weeks of the syllabus in the great books course that affirmed that I was in the right place. Ted, in many ways, kind of reached his hand down into the waves as I was flailing and let me know that, no, you're really in the right place. And what began as a student-teacher relationship became colleagues as I went on after graduation to head up a nonprofit that became a center of state and local policy here at the policy school. And then obviously first becoming interim dean and then dean. And through it all, my relationship with Ted is one that I will always treasure for reasons that I know you all know, but I would not be the person I am today were it not for Ted. Not just what I learned in the classroom, but what I learned about life, what I learned about dealing with disappointment and pain. Through it all, Ted was a heroic figure, a man of great courage, academically, from a scholarly perspective, but just personally, a heroic figure. And so I'm just so grateful to each of you for participating in this. I know that Bill and I, when we kind of laid out, and Bill, first, let's give a thanks to Bill McClay just for his amazing leadership of this. I think there were only two people that were not able to join us from our original list of possible speakers. And all of you, I know, have made various sacrifices to be here, which speaks to your love of Ted and appreciation of this work. And I'm just so grateful to each of you for being here. And in that, you see what we have laid out, first beginning tonight with a talk from his dear friend and co-author, Bruce Frohnen. And then tomorrow we will get into a series of panels, beginning just a quick look at the agenda ahead, opening at 9 o'clock and then running through a series of panels. I'll get into some other logistical notes as we close this evening. But again, I want to thank all of you for being a part of this. Bill, I just, again, want to salute you for your incredible leadership of all this. I also want to thank our Pepperdine team who has made tonight's possible, specifically Melissa Espinoza, who I know has been in touch with many of you regarding logistics and travel and so forth. Melissa, thank you for all of your great work. And our team here as well. So I want to get us underway with Bruce's keynote for this evening, which, as you see, is entitled, Shall We Govern Ourselves? And I thought as a way of maybe teeing up that talk, I would draw from Ted's syllabus for that great books course that he taught here for so many years. As you all know, in your relationship with Ted, there were no short emails or communications with Ted, right? I mean, everything that he wrote, whether it was a syllabus or a response to a very brief question that you may have just shot him via email, things came back thoughtfully and provocatively often. And that was certainly true of his syllabi as well. I mean, first off, even though Ted taught the Great Books course here for decades, it was rarely the same course. Ted was constantly improving it, working it, looking at what was going on, things that were being written, topics in the popular culture that he wanted to draw from, and that certainly was true of his last syllabus, of the last class that he taught here, which I know that Ashley was involved in co-teaching, and I did as well for the fall of 2022. This was the required reading for that Great Books class, for his last class. Aristotle, The Politics. Rousseau, the major political writings of Rousseau. Edmund Burke, Reflections. De Tocqueville, Democracy. Nietzsche, On the Genealogy of Morals. And Matthew Crawford's Why We Drive. Now, this was and relevant to the topic of Bruce's talk, which will kick us off here this evening. This was the introductory paragraph from that syllabus. A democratic political order depends on a consonance among moral philosophy, politics, and policy. Schools of public policy tend to focus on policy analysis to understand policy questions and alternatives, creating ever greater rigor of a social scientific approach without approaching the moral and political components with comparable rigor. Meanwhile, political and moral theorists in various academic disciplines explore their questions also with great rigor, but without keen attention to particular policy issues in context. At Pepperdine School of Public Policy, we seek to bring these three components, moral philosophy, politics, and policy, into serious public analysis of contemporary policy matters. Now, that debate and discussion was grounded in a very simple conviction that in America, we are tasked with governing ourselves. And this is no easy task. It requires a culture that can promote those values and virtues that are required to do that. And it's fair to say, and I'm not here to cast aspersions, that in a lot of these kinds of policy programs, it's quite a technocratic approach to looking at why quantitatively policy A is better than policy B without asking those much deeper questions, those human questions, the public part of public policy, which James Q. Wilson first forced us to answer back in the late 90s when the program was being formed. And that baton, in many ways, was passed to Ted, who taught hundreds of graduate policy students the importance of bringing these three components together. So without further ado, I'd like to bring up Ted's close friend, colleague, co-author. He's a professor of law at the College of Law at Ohio Northern University, Please join me in welcoming Bruce Frohnen.
Well, thank you very much, Pete, and thanks to both Pete and Bill McClay and everyone else at Pepperdine who made this conference possible. It is, in fact, a great honor to be here and to share some reflections on what we can learn from the life and the writings of a good man, an important thinker, and a friend to pretty much all of us here, Ted McAllister. Now, I hadn't planned on any personal reflections here. I know that they're going to be happening over the course of the weekend. I'll just say that, I knew Ted for several decades. We didn't get in touch as much as I would have liked because he was trained in history. I was trained in political science, and then, I went to law school. So we were in different subfields, so we didn't get to the same conferences very much, but Intercollegiate Studies Institute, Liberty Fund, these were places where we ran into each other. And it was always a joy to be with him. And he always brought the life of the mind wherever he was. But when, toward the end of his life, we began our journey that turned into 2 books, I have to say that everyone had led me to believe that there would be some Sturm und Drang working with Ted. And there was absolutely none of that. It was just an absolute joy. 2 minds that met. I felt like I'd met a brother I'd never known. That made it all the harder for me and for a lot of people when he left. But he was what he was. And if you were on that wavelength, there was nothing but joy. And that was a great blessing. But I guess here, since I'm cognizant of the fact that this is the first talk, so if I screw up too badly, it may cast a pall over the entire weekend. But the other thing about it is I hope that we're all going to remember, as we do share some stories of an interesting soul, powerful soul, courageous soul, that we'll remember that it isn't just that we've lost a brother, a dear friend, but that we have something still with us. Not just as example, but I think it's important, and one of the reasons I'm so thankful we're having this conference is that it's important that we remember that this man was an important thinker, that he left us a body of work that is well worthy of study for its own sake. And so that's what I'm going to concentrate in my talk here, because I think he gave an important, not just example, but an important analysis of what it takes to be a free people. An analysis which became ever more urgently needed over the last 10 to 20 years, and which he recognized was ever more urgently needed, and which he strove to put into great clarity. So, like all true scholars, Ted spent his entire career working to integrate methods and insights from a variety of disciplines. These included history, particularly cultural history, political thought, and public policy. These, along with his experience as a deacon in his church, made him especially capable at diagnosing what ails our society and what might be necessary to recover some of the virtues that we've so clearly lost. It was my pleasure to write 2 books with him, a pleasure that assures me that he can provide us with both important insights and a helpful example of how we might restore something of our character as a people and something of our traditional decency and vigor as well. Again, as Pete pointed out, the key is self-government. Now, that term has a double but self-reinforcing meaning. First, as Ted often pointed out, the self in self-government refers to a people. Here we mean the American people, who hold that their political freedom, which Ted defined as the freedom to govern ourselves, our communities, and our associations, was essential to them. Second, self-government refers to the need for each of us to govern him or herself. As again, Ted pointed out, to be free, we must be able to think about freedom as the product of a well-ordered soul. And so the overriding question we face in this era of broken homes, broken cities, and a constitutional system that seems broken beyond repair is not primarily one of institutional reforms or microeconomics, pardon me. The real question is, quoting, whether we have honor. Do we have the self-respect to hold ourselves to higher standards, to assert our ability to be self-reliant, to demand that as self-reliant people, we be self-governing? Honor, self-respect, self-reliance. None of these is a mere belief. None is a technique. None is rooted in ideology or abstract thought. Each is fundamentally a character trait. Each is central to what it means to be a good person. Now, that's important for more reasons than one. It's important because, in the end, what are we left with? Our character. Our soul, we might say, and that's what you're stuck with for eternity. From a more political perspective, the order of our soul determines, in large measure, the order of our commonwealth. Only an honorable, self-respecting people can be free. And Americans, at least, have always sought to be free, at least until recently. In relevant terms, of course, a good soul means good character, and good character is a matter of having the right habits. We form the right habits by doing the right things. Perhaps most important, and sadly most often forgotten, we have to do the right things at the right times and in the right proportion to build a good life and a good society. That no doubt sounds hopelessly complex, but really it's not. For example, it's not always good to be magnanimous. It's certainly not always good to be generous, especially when you're spending someone else's money or tax dollars, right? All I mean is that we must lead good lives, and that's a matter of priorities as well as day-to-day virtue. Again, we'll hear more about Ted the Man over the course of the conference, and that's important. But I simply want to note that his honorable, obviously imperfect, ornery, but noble character was an example of how to lead a good life, providing service to others as one ought, within the limits of our fallen nature. And I hope I'll be forgiven for taking the liberty of pointing out the nature of his multifaceted but integrated life. Follower of Christ, husband, father, son, member of his communities. Most importantly for us today, a member of the faculty of the School of Public Policy at Pepperdine University. I mean that not merely to suck up to Pete, although I'm always happy to do that. But in this last capacity, he was a teacher, scholar, and both a spokesman and a fighter for an understanding of the intrinsic purpose of a Christian school of public policy in the humane tradition of Christianity, within a Christian university, in a specific place and a specific time. This is the kind of life we should strive to lead, one which is grounded in particular experience. More of us have to lead this kind of life if we were to restore something meaningful, something lasting in the ruins of our republic. Faith, family, community. All are essential to any rebuilding of order in the soul and in the Commonwealth. All are under attack in America today. All have suffered greatly at the hands of a hostile government. They've lost much of their ability to shape good character. In their damaged state, they've left Americans as a people out of self-control, unable to govern its impulses, let alone its communities. How then do we restore self-government? How shall we govern ourselves? In one sense, the answer is obvious from what I've said before, character. But that simple answer presents us with a complex problem. Namely, how do we repair a national character that has become corrupt? How can we do this when it's so hard to convince people that we even have a character as a people beyond a few shared abstract beliefs? Or even that character is indeed important. So a few thoughts from Ted's writings, mostly those gems of essays that he wrote over the years, with a nod to his important book, Revolt Against Modernity, and an assist from some things that Ted and I wrote together. So what must we do so that we can again govern ourselves? First, know thyself. Recovery requires not an ideology, but knowledge of who we are. There's an essential religious grounding to this that goes beyond self-knowledge or knowledge of the order of being. We need not all express it in precise terms, but we need to live in what I would term natural law, which Ted referred to as ontological realism, quoting, a recognition that the universe is, that it has a structure and reality, independent of our own thoughts about it. Okay? Well, this sounds abstract. In practice, it's merely the recognition that we do not and cannot make our own reality. No, my truth will substitute for our real nature as political beings imbued with reason and the capacity for virtue, but also stained by sin and defined by our need to forge bonds with one another. This experience of reality is real and concrete. It is not a creature of abstract thought. It should be a warning against viewing persons as properly guided and shaped by any mere set of principles, what Michael Oakeshott derided as cribs of experience. Americans historically have understood the need to see right conduct as a matter of, well, conduct, and not mere theory. Unfortunately, this common sense approach has been undermined by an enthusiasm for abstraction in public life. Too often, well-intentioned people seek to define America, this is a quote from Ted, as grounded on a set of universal ideas. But the great rhetoric of the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, well, it's indeed great, but it isn't itself who we are. As Ted put it, quoting, those ideas are part of our history, and most Americans tend to believe them in some form or another. But we shouldn't confuse them with much deeper sources of our national character. Eloquent and persuasive articulations of principles are important, but they're liable to misunderstanding and misuse. A people's character, in fact, emerges from how people really live and think. Principles concerning freedom and so on become real only when they become part of a story that is rooted in experiences, attachments, affections that emerge from a self-ruling life in partnerships with families, churches, communities, governments, and the like. In brief, we aren't formed by abstract universal principles, but by our relationships in daily life. How then do we understand ourselves without recourse to abstractions like equality, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? It's more difficult to describe, frankly, than it is to live. Let me recur to an encapsulation that was provided by Wilmore Kendall and George Carey. In the basic symbols of the American political tradition, they borrowed a term from Eric Vogelin, to whom, as we'll hear tomorrow, Ted often looked in his own work. They talked about America's central symbol, our vision of who we are as Americans, and that was of a virtuous people deliberating under God. A virtuous people deliberating under God. This was, and for about half of America, remains the essential symbol of American self-understanding. It's a picture that we have in the backs of our minds as we go about our lives, at times consciously, but often instinctively, choosing how to act, what to value, and what to treat as most important to us, both as individual persons and as members of communities. When we consider what's best in ourselves, what we desire to be in our nature and daily lives, this symbol, what Ted called political freedom, isn't just central, but ordering. It helps us decide and or act according to what is most important in any given circumstance. To understand this symbol, like ourselves, isn't a matter of philosophical analysis, of boiling things down to essential principle. It's a matter of understanding who we are in practice. Now, that's not merely a matter of charts, symbols, and data. It's a matter of imagination. That's why we talk about a symbol. We're able to picture ourselves as part of that community, deliberating under God. But again, it begins with the need to know thyself. It's important for peoples as well as individuals. Please pardon the long quotation, but it's from Ted, and it seems essential here, all right? Quoting, "First, the founding should be understood not as a moment in 1776, but as a settlement of peoples, primarily from England, who established a hybrid cultural and political form that stressed, among other things, inherited liberties, common law, and the fact that community is prior to government. That communities create government to serve the prior reality of that community. This beginning place stresses our most important characteristic, that we, Americans, are a people who want to rule ourselves, and that we do so typically through communities and associations. Second, Americans were from the start more in love with opportunities, with chance-taking, with new starts, with the lure of making their fortune or finding a new opportunity out west, than they were with equality. In this context, Americans were less interested in equal opportunity, which is philosophically nonsense, than with an abundance of opportunities. Third, the attraction of America among immigrants was not primarily our idea, as expressed by Thomas Jefferson or anyone else, but the same sense that opportunities abounded and that America offered everything from a new profession to a new identity. Each person, even if he or she faced all manner of other persecutions upon arrival, could chart his or her own course and live free from the cultural, social, economic, and political restrictions of Italy or Poland or whatever the country of origin. End long quote. So from our very inception, we've been a settler people that's governed itself as communities rather than political states. Our forebears, in the story of America, if not our own family trees, were a people who covenanted and combined themselves into civil body politics. A community that would follow such laws as seemed best for the common good. The story, illustrated in many documents like the Mayflower Compact, has of course been told many times. Unfortunately, over the last several decades, it's been diminished in our memories by hostile ideologues, especially in our schools, who wish us to forget our tradition and our traditional character. The same could be said for our understanding that we have been a people that doesn't live in resentment or dependence on the state, instead embracing opportunities to better the lives of individual persons, families, and communities. A people that seizes on a life of adventure. This endangered, but not yet dead, is the American character. Key here is remembering the special gift of Americans, often forgot, that of retaining order with mobility and genuine diversity. Americans did not simply immigrate then stay in one place, nor did most of them commence a life of ceaseless individual wandering. Many brought communities with them from their homelands. Others built them before setting out west. Still others literally forged communities on the wagon trail or in their settler communities. They had the habit and the art of making order because they carried with them a tradition of seeking order, even in radically new circumstances. It had become an art that was ingrained as a habit. Now, obviously, this understanding of who we are highlights another element necessary to govern ourselves. Of course, obviously, when it comes to self-government, you can't do it yourself. Self-government begins internally with order in the soul, but it's practiced socially as part of community. Our problems won't go away if we sign up for some simplistic plan of freedom in the abstract, be it economic, social, or political. Such plans will merely further undermine the institutions that are already atrophying. That said, however, it's equally mistaken to see the state, and especially the centralized national administrative state, as an ally in the fight for self-government. Public policy does not mean using state power for given ends. It also means limiting or even eliminating state power in certain areas so that we can achieve the common good. This was a particular concern for Ted as a member of a faculty of public policy. These schools have their roots, of course, in Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, a society that was to be great, meaning large and too complicated for citizens to fathom. Citizens were to be relieved of the burden of governing themselves by an army of experts in various fields trained to isolate and solve problems. They would order our society without the messiness of political discussion and without the need for tradition, custom, or other aspects of human nature that go beyond utility and the aesthetic charms of intellectual models. The problem, of course, is that such experts are, in fact, and this is a quote, trapped by a vocabulary of utility that makes no allowance for the highest human faculty, imagination. That highest faculty is essential to the character of free citizens, of people who are capable of ruling and being ruled in turn. Now, the character of a free people is, in fact, inimical to the planned economy and the planned society of progressives, neoliberals, and Greens, all of whom have remarkably similar plans for the people, namely as isolated selves who are free if and to the extent they accept their roles as disposable economic inputs and cultural wards of the administrative state. These elites have offshored the jobs people need to raise families and give meaning to their lives. They've undermined the families that alone foster decent character and house the desires that can render us little more than savages. And they've chained our local associations, including local governments, as well as religious and other communities, to a set of hostile ideas and regulations that eliminate their self-governance and take away their very reason to exist. The centralization of power in the federal government has built a system hostile to self-government and the habits necessary to it. It's fostered a corrupt class and a corrupt society, no longer ruled by law. We have then a new elite hostile to our very being as a self-governing people. Now, perhaps a distinction is important here. Ted was often called a populist. It wasn't meant as a compliment. He didn't really take it as a compliment. But it stemmed from a certain sympathy that many of us had for those who were and are today left out by moneyed interests, by progressive forces that use the power of the state to concentrate power in a way that harms those who have fewer and lesser capacities to defend themselves. But he never denied, in fact, he often asserted the need for elites. Too much democracy, in the sense of a demand for equality and obedience to the will of the undifferentiated mass, brings the corruption of centralized power and dependence on the state. It brings what we have now. Now, our society has always been democratic in an important but quite limited sense. Our laws do not enforce class privilege, or at least they didn't until recently. Our society is not one of equality, but of plurality. To take one of Ted's central examples, more than a tax revolt, the American Revolution was about the preservation of plural ways of living, plural cultures, and plural liberties against a powerful, centralized, distant, and homogenizing governing elite. Over the course of our history, America has had many elites. Some have been better than others, though since the progressives, it seems to have gone down successively. But something terrible has happened over the last 20 years or so. Something that I know for a fact deeply troubled Ted as it deeply troubles me. Quoting, "The deepest fact of our time is that America has a bad elite, a mendacious one, whose skills, values, goals, tastes, and types of knowledge are hostile to our nation's inherited cultures and plural people. Intoxicated by the power possible with emerging technologies, inspired by visions that only a deracinated, globalist perspective could make attractive, this elite thinks of creative destruction as appropriate to be applied to culture. To save us from global warming, pandemics, racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, and whatever else might frighten us into submission, our elites gather ever more power to themselves. A power to shape our lives, our communities, and our characters. To dictate for us a new diet, new workspaces, new home spaces, new means of travel, a new language complete with pronouns that will train us to be afraid. Now, to govern ourselves then, we must replace not some flaw in our law, policy, or constitution, but our elite. You'll hear more tomorrow about the book that Ted and I wrote on conservatism. Coming Home includes a program of political action aimed at retaking control of our culture by reclaiming educational institutions, our borders, the work economy, and the liberty of our fundamental associations. Those policies of civic engagement, legislative change, and institutional reinvigoration are important. But the point of the book was our need to come home. Coming home, returning to places where we in some important sense belong, entails a change in attitude, a rebirth a rebirth of honor and local patriotism. We can never be fully at home in this world, but to find a way station to eternity, it's crucial that we build place through common action, thereby shaping common memories. To do so requires renewed understanding of what it means to build a home. Most of all, of course, it requires civic engagement. In his chapter in the volume that he edited with Bill McClay on why place matters, Ted outlined the nature and necessity of acts of civil engagement. Honor is, of course, necessary to begin with. A sense of honor will encourage us to develop habits of belonging, enabling us to forge an almost invisible cord of affections to particular people, local institutions, and places. We all become part of a story larger than ourselves, but peopled with friends with whom we share common ground and common experiences of ruling and being ruled in turn. Civic engagement, properly understood, means cultures in which citizens see themselves as partners in faith, in government, in life as lived on a particular place and time that's part of a tradition beyond our sight, but not our understanding. Finally then, what's in it for us? This all sounds lovely in a poetic, pseudo-romantic sort of way, but who's going to buy it? Right? How should we convince ourselves and our fellows to give up the life of constant sensory stimulation in favor of the hard work of governing ourselves? Much easier to do what is increasingly common in my own poor, burned-out former industrial town of Fostoria, Ohio, which is populated in significant part by kids whose parents were unemployed for the last 20 years and who work just enough to keep the cable on and the weeds stoked. And seem perfectly happy with that because they don't know any better. The answer, though, is more appealing than it may at first seem. It's a sense of belonging and of accomplishment. These can be difficult goods, especially for an unruly people, which we traditionally have been, once it's lost its ties of tradition. Taking the success of one's home as one's own can be difficult. It involves It involves self-sacrifice, as anyone who's just put his kids through college can tell you. I'll detail it in great numbers, and I'll give you a microeconomic chart of my own experience, if you like. Then again, it allows us to see ourselves in those around us and genuinely enjoy and even take a certain pride in their success. We have to choose our place as a whole, a place complete with inhabitants that we can make better and that we recognize can make us better. This is local patriotism, as Ted phrased it, and it can show up in ways that seem odd and uninspiring in light of today's woke parody of Puritan sensibilities. in which all flaws are to be judged harshly, except those of personal self-indulgence. We must learn to find the genuine inspiration in this honorable calling and spread the news. If I may then, without taxing your patience too much, another example. This one taking from the second book that Ted and I wrote together, Character in the American Experience. Now, some of you may be aware that Ted was a proud Oklahoman. Some of you may be aware that Oklahomans are often called Sooners. That title, of course, refers to people who participated in the Oklahoma land rush, most prominently the contest for land that began in April of 1889. The federal government had seized territory from several Indian tribes, supposedly on account of their having sided with the Confederacy. If I were an Indian at that time, I might have too. The government then held a literal rush for land on that date, giving away plots to those who got there first from a subtle starting point at the sound of a cannon shot. Yeah, well, not everybody waited. Many settlers hid in the bushes, quite literally, near the area that would become Oklahoma City to get a jump on good claims. They arrived sooner than they were supposed to. All right, we all get the joke, right? Now, cheating isn't a good thing, but Americans have always managed to combine a strong sense of honor with a certain respect for the clever gamesman. All right? Think P.T. Barnum. Ted often brought up the example. But also think, Wyatt Earp, who had once been accused of being a horse thief. Oklahomans have, shall we say, made their peace with the cheating in their past by making the Sooner the mascot of their own university. Now, why do I bring this up? Several reasons. The first is to say to those who are upset at the unpleasantness and untidiness of much that's going on with political decorum in our current policies, chill out. Politics have always been a contact sport in the United States. Our politics were built on hard cider. George Washington knew this. That's why he rolled out the barrels, got them loaded, and got their votes. James Madison thought it was beneath him, and so he lost. Next time around, he figured it out, spent some money, got some hard cider and some food for the folks, and he won, okay? But it was more than that. It was punctuated at times by the old idea of being tarred, feathered, and ridden out of town on a rail. Think about those terms and what they entail. Hot tar, feathers, tied to a rail. Not pleasant, okay? Now, I'm certainly not recommending a return to these practices. Given my role on my own campus, I might be the first victim. I'm not recommending it, let alone worse abuses. But I think it behooves us to remember again that politics in the United States is and always has been a bit of a contact sport. To deny this is to deny to the virtuous any possibility of winning. What's more, if we want to avoid genuinely abusive practices, which we should, we have to work much harder to restore order in our communities. Even-handed justice under law is necessary for, justice. It's also necessary for order and to prevent ugly outbreaks. Finally, I mention the Sooners as a way of introducing a short story that I think illustrates what we can hope for in this life from honor. All right, let me explain. From the very beginning, Ted wanted us to have a chapter in Character in the American Experience about the founding of Oklahoma City in the land rush. Brilliant man that I am, I titled it, Rome Wasn't Built in a Day, but Oklahoma City was. Yeah, Ted wasn't terribly impressed either. But he let it stay, so there it is. Okay? And it makes the point, I say. The chapter is the story of how Oklahoma City was built in a day. Sooners and those who came later showed up with tents and even shacks on wheels to stake out claims to city lots as well as farms. What ensued was not pure chaos, but it wasn't rainbows and unicorns either. And it wasn't entirely fair. One man in particular, William Cooch, formed a kind of gang. He and his cronies not only came early to get the best spots, they used stand-ins and other tricks to gain a near monopoly on what would become the most valuable plots. They forced others to buy free plots from them, and they demanded bribes and special treatment to allow the laying out of roads. Now, soon-to-be Oklahomans didn't simply roll over for Cooch. They were all Sooners. They fought back and found a champion in a man named Angelo Scott, a newspaper man who stepped in almost immediately to help negotiate land claims and keep the peace. This isn't a story of the hero Angelo Scott, though. He was a bit of a hero, but he wasn't some truth-telling social justice warrior who decided to take aim at all injustice and declare the abstract principles should rule us all. He was a dude who helped out. Okay? He was far from alone. At least two syndicates besides Cooch's, less unscrupulous but still entrepreneurial, shall we say, had attempted to organize Oklahoma City, and they vigorously prosecuted their own claims. And Scott himself helped, but only helped, organize town meetings in which many folks spoke their minds and organizations were formed, not all of them with Scott's approval, to settle the controversies. Okay? Now, in the event, Cooch kind of won. Most of his claims were ratified, and he got himself elected mayor. So the bad guys do sometimes get power. I know this comes as a great shock, but it does happen. Then again, things didn't work out all that well for Cooch. He was soon shot dead by a man who was fighting him over the ownership of one of the other plots. Okay? Scott himself didn't become some kind of local boss or perpetual crusader. He settled down, he founded a newspaper that reported the local news, so, something different from today. He stayed active in local civic and especially educational life, and he died with honors. As such things go, given that we all end up the same place, that's a happy story. What does this teach us? You can't do it alone. Every Angelo Scott needs allies, those competing syndicates, and also an active, intelligent, aggressive citizenry willing and able to fight for its interests. Not every Cooch will get what he deserves in this life. We've all learned that by now, I hope. But one of the advantages of a historical understanding is the knowledge that we all die in the end. That may be tragic for some. But then again, personally at least, I've always thought we all have better places to be eventually anyways. So it's not that bad. We miss people, but we all got better places to be. What's more, if you work hard and strive to be a decent, patriotic member of your community, you may take some hits. You may not even come out ahead. But at least you'll have people in your family, your church, your neighborhood, your club, the Grange, whatever it may be, who are going to have your back. That should be a great comfort to all of us. And if you work hard, you're lucky, you can see your kids grow up, you can die having done some good in the world, perhaps even being thanked for some of your troubles. That's about it for most of us. And frankly, that should be enough. The problem comes with people who want, demand, and are willing to seize more at the cost of their honor. These are the people we have to be careful of, especially when they start messing with our dishwashers. Pardon me. Personal problem. It's one thing to hit the trail to make your fortune. And when syndicates are cooked up to take what isn't rightfully theirs, we can't count on any government, let alone the one in Washington, to make things right. Nor, I might add, can we simply look to the leaders in our other institutions. Far too many have become part of the problem. This is how a Borg operates, after all. We have to fight, demonstrate, run for local office, even sue. Yes, the lawyer said sue. Whether it's the school board or the agency attacking our kids, as well as serve in our local church and business. We have to govern ourselves. And that means organizing ourselves to defend what's ours, including our traditions and our home. A home within a society that's rooted not in my truth, not in a tolerance that means ignoring other people's troubles and mental illness and pretending that it's normal, making everyone else bow to it so that you can be left alone with your own sins. But in the truth about who we are, what matters, what makes us fully human, and what it means to lead a good, decent, honorable life. I think Ted did a lot to make this truth and this path clearer for us. So let me close, yes, finally, with a quotation I think shows his typical combination of a noble call for virtue and some arch criticism for those who refuse to heed it. Quoting, "Designing our political world to encourage the growth and development of both localist politics and mediating institutions requires that people actually want such arrangements and that they prefer the messy adventure of self-rule to the comfortable slavery of the administrative state. May we all have and promote that preference for messy adventure." Thank you. Do you have any questions? Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Yes, Mark.
How does self-governance apply to a university?
Anyone else?
Universities are actually one of the oldest and most important models of self-governance. The problem being that universities no longer, for the most part, are universities in the old sense. They're not a community that is devoted to the life of the mind. It should mean governance by those who are chosen with the common good in mind, the common good understood as the furtherance of the pursuit of knowledge, dedicated to those policies and procedures that make that pursuit of knowledge more effective and possible. It requires that one govern with the end of teaching and other forms of learning, rather than gaining government contracts, rather than signaling virtue, rather than making a platform for particular people to either make large sums of money themselves. Tens of millions of dollars presidents of universities are making now. You looking forward to that, Pete? He says no. Well, obviously you haven't gotten with the program, have you? Right? That's a corrupting program. The idea of a university, the reality of a university, is something different from what it has become, largely because of a system of loans, which are basically just bribes to keep the place open, subsidies, tax breaks, which are used in order to allow universities to gain large investment portfolios that let them be independent of their students. And more than anything else, the government contracts involved. You know, there was a time back in the 60s and 70s when people would talk about, you know, the industrial military complex and all that. Universities were always a significant part of that. Now, the military is much less a part of it. Instead, it's, well, public health, which I have trouble not putting scare quotes around since the whole COVID madness took place. But it's the search for money. And obviously, this undermines the pursuit of truth, as we saw with the demands from various public figures to make it look as if the various COVID policies, the green policies, and so on, that we see strangling our economy are not questioned. So the governance of a university is perhaps one of the most important places where proper governance could take place, and the most tragic place where it has utterly failed us. I've stunned you all into silence.
Great. Yes, we have one over here.
Yes, ma'am.
How are you? Thanks for an excellent talk. I'm just perplexed by our local elections. 80% of voters did not even show up to vote.
Right.
Please comment.
Why would you? The problem with local elections, the problem with local government is that it no longer matters. Local governments now are ruled principally by mandates coming from higher levels of government. You know, when I worked in Washington, the senator that I worked for kept claiming that what we're going to do is we're going to end unfunded mandates. Unfortunately, what he meant from that was that we would fund the mandates, which still takes away the actual purpose of local government. You're not really governing yourself if all you're doing is seeing to it that the regulations according to the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Civil Rights Act, whatever, may be perfectly good laws. But if all you're doing at the local level is putting into effect the policies that have been made at a higher level of government, you're not governing yourself. You're helping determine a few procedures. You're doing housekeeping. You're following orders. It's not interesting. It's not all that important. It's a ground for corruption, not political participation. One of the best things that's happened in decades, I think, is all the uproar over what's going on in the public schools. Because, of course, you finally have people recognizing what's been going on for decades, folks. I can remember I went to the public schools in Northern California in the 70s. I can tell you, most of this stuff was around then. It's just people didn't know about it. But now that people are genuinely upset, there's a possibility, dare I say, that there will be citizens actually becoming involved in at least one area of local governance. Unfortunately, we've become so habituated to the idea that it's all about politics is this thing that's done over there that the experts will figure out. We'll give them every couple of years, every 4 years. We'll give them a yes or no by voting for one party or the other. And that party will then be in charge of the program, and we'll just sit back, see how it works out, decide whether we want to hire them again or not. And that's not how a people governs itself. That's how a people answers referendums as a giant undifferentiated mass, yes or no. That's not self-governance. And it's not going to get anyone terribly excited. Hi, Bill.
I'm just waving.
Oh, well, I was thinking you were taking a bid on a painting.
Early in your talk, maybe I should stand up. Early in your talk, you mentioned, made a very interesting distinction. I'd like to try to draw you out on it and elaborate on it a little bit. And that is between equality of opportunity, which you treated rather roughly as a concept.
That was Ted.
But on the other hand, an abundance of opportunity.
Right.
Which can you talk a little more about that? Because I think it's
Oh, you bet.
we talk so much about equality of opportunity versus equality of outcome or
Right.
equality of result. We have this, excuse me, using the word binary sort of term. And we need to be more non-binary. Trap you. Could you talk a little more about what it means to have an abundance of opportunities?
Right. Yeah, no, that's a terrific question. I can say that because, again, this is Ted. Taking it from a number of essays that he wrote on. I agree with it completely. But his point was that equality of opportunity, like equality of results, is the product of government structures. We're going to make sure that everybody has the same opportunity as everybody else. And this is where I think it's important to keep in mind there was some discussions as to whether progressivism and everything was simply some foreign import that came in. The Locofocos, a group in the early 19th century who painted themselves as libertarians, were among the first to declare that equal opportunity was a requirement for America. And the only way you can get equal opportunity is if everybody's kids are brought up in state schools. The parents can visit them every once in a while, but if you're going to have true equal opportunity, you have to have the same education. You have to have the same environment that you're growing up in, right? And of course, when you die, everything goes to the state so they can run the state schools, right? And that's merely taking, reductio ad absurdum to what really is inherent in the idea, that we can somehow even the playing field. Think about that. You don't even a playing field by, mowing the lawn. You got to dig it up and relay it, right? That's pretty intrusive. That tells people what they're going to do from the cradle to the grave. You can't do it, certainly not in a free society. You can, however, have a government that's committed to making sure that there are plenty of opportunities for everyone to get ahead. Now, what does that mean? Does that not involve public policy? Well, sure it involves public policy. It involves public policy that is pro-entrepreneurship, that is, not huge corporations, but pro-small business entrepreneurship, pro-trade, also one that leaves enough room for people to go out and find a good job, which means things like defending your borders, making sure that people have those options. There are things that do need to be done. You know, one of the great fights over time in the United States has always been over transportation systems. And long, detailed, it'll get boring, except for me, I'll enjoy it. But, you know, things like the railroads and the freeways and everything, were those in fact great spurs to opportunity, or did they in fact channel opportunity into very narrow ways? So all the choices that you make as a government can affect whether you've got opportunities. But freedom, real borders, and the ability to found new communities are the keys to opportunity and what we all really need, because you never know where that opportunity is going to be for you. I was convinced my son was going to be an engineer because my family was full of engineers. He threw those Legos out the window at the age of 4. Couldn't care less about the erector set. He's now making more money than I am doing computer crud. More power to him, right? So it's a matter of, are you choosing freedom, or do you want a plan for a kind of utopian vision? I think that's what it comes down to. Anybody else? Oh, hi.
Hi. I kind of want to go back to follow up with her question.
Sure.
Play devil's advocate a little bit, where you say it requires participation, local communities, you know, in local governance, 80% of people don't. What would be your answer to, I mean, I just know enough families that are working, just trying to work to keep the food on the table too. Both parents are working. You know,
right.
The reality of the situation is that being involved in politics is a bit of a luxury, you know, to be local and engaged and all that kind of stuff. I mean, it can be. So are the constraints of reality, that the reality we've created now of 2 parents working, right? Jobs that require overtime, a lot of time to put into them, you know, people traveling,
right.
Not being engaged and having the time to do such things.
Right. The neoliberal model that has forced us all into being basically contract workers for 60 hours a week. Husbands, wives, to get their kids onto that treadmill so that they can go to the right schools, so that they can join us in that drudging life. That was itself a creation of the Great Society. All right? The claim was, we're freeing women from the slavery of the household. Right? What they were doing was reducing the value of labor. So both parties had to work a lot to afford what their parents had had with a single income family. The inflation that's built into this, the hyper-emphasis on urbanization, these are policies that produce this. I'm not going to throw at you that this is all culture. It's partly culture, but a lot of it's economics, and it has to do with globalization. A number of policies that we've engaged in, including refusing to defend our border, have produced a much higher cost of living than we ever would have imagined. When you look at the actual cost of regulation, the actual cost of the various green requirements, the cost of these various subsidies, well, y'all are in California. You're at the epicenter of this particular form of reconfiguration of life. These things are expensive. And if you look at the standard of living in the United States, it's gone like this. Okay, and I would say there are reasons for that, most of them having to do with the increasing power of an administrative state that's devoted to concentrating wealth and power. How do you fight that? You can say, well, that's not at the local level you can fight that. Well, in the short term, you know, we're in a kind of culture war and economic war here. So a lot of us are spending more time than we might like fighting that war. I'm just saying part of that is taking back the locality. Part of that also has to be fighting the administrative state. And that's been taking place in a lot of different areas. One of my favorite guys doing this is a fellow named Philip Hamburger, who wrote a very important book called Is Administrative Law Unlawful? His answer is yes. This is a constitutional law scholar, and it's a pretty strong argument. And we have to fight those battles. So I agree with you. It's a terrible situation, and it's getting exponentially worse. we really have passed a point where if this is not undone quite quickly, things will never be the same. Because the current, to use Ted's phrase, mendacious elite won't allow it. And that means we're all essentially serfs. We're all going to be living in our hive-like condominium, waiting for our electric bus as we chew on our fried cockroaches, waiting to go to our little job and come home to nothing. Everyone uplifted now? Sorry. Is there somebody else? Oh, I'm sorry. Hi.
Hi. Will there be steamed cockroaches?
I think it's deep fried.
You've been looking at this from like a governmental kind of legal standpoint. It strikes me that one of the reasons I might not be interested in local elections is because there is no real local economy, local problems. All the jobs, everything is part of these larger national companies. And the homogenization of the economy means that if you're really going to make things local, you need local businesses and you need more of a local set of issues that we can then deliberate about as a community. So there are these legal obstacles. How do you tackle the economic obstacles, which strike me as much larger and perhaps even part and parcel?
Well, no, that's an interesting and a difficult question, although it's one that we're seeing play out right now. I can tell you again, in the burned out former industrial area that I live in, all right, there's not so much of the international economy left any longer. They've already abandoned us. Yeah. And what we see that's kind of interesting is there's a fellow named Manel. He runs the local mill, huge mill. You probably get their bread. Their flour is probably in your bread. But it's in Fostoria and one other place. And that's where he does it, because he's lived in Fostoria for 3 generations. He decided to run for mayor so that he could cut the rents, so that he could try to get at least some of the downtown reoccupied. A lot of support behind him. And the idea was literally to give something back and try to build some things. Now, will it work? I have no idea. Things are pretty far gone in Fostoria. But I know a number of stories like this that have come up. The reason they've come up is because the international system has abandoned anybody who's not rich. It really is about grinding down the middle class, and in particular, leaving the small towns to die. That is a terrible place to be, but such terrible places also breed opportunity. Obviously, in order to fight back effectively, we have to work on all of the various, again, the federal mandates, the regulations, and so on, the administrative state. You know, I've been in many conferences. I remember I was at one with Bill Galston, and at the end of it, you know, Washington, D.C. think tank, a really famous guy. And at one point, he stopped me mid-sentence and said, I'm tired of hearing it. I don't want to hear another talk about how bad the administrative state is. It's here, get used to it. And that's really the attitude. And if we let them get away with that, we're done. So I agree with you that there's a lot of economic stuff that has to take place, but I would argue that there remains enough virtue and enough drive and enough entrepreneurship in enough of us that if we can free things up, there is a real possibility, that's all I can offer, but a real possibility that we'll see that there's still some life left in American communities yet. That wasn't stirring enough for you all? Yeah, I see, yeah.
Yeah, so more of a comment or a suggestion. Connecting all these is the lady asked why is turnout so low on municipal elections, and because people are busy. It makes perfect sense. You put your finger on the other big part of it, that there's no long, everything's dominated by something a higher level government makes no pay. To my mind, one of the most startling developments of recent years that is unremarked upon is the collapse of civic politics. So the turnout in the last LA mayor's election was like 18%, Philadelphia 15%. You know, as recently as the 90s, you had high turnout for mayor elections. So part of it is the reason you vote. But the other one is quite often the municipal elections, and especially school board elections, are held in New York in January. They're not held on general election day. So one practical reform, let's move all those elections back to the same day we vote for president. Then more people, not everybody, more people will pay attention to those races if they're reformed in a certain way. And you know, we hear all this voter suppression, right? Who wants a school board election in January? The teachers union wants it in January because they dominate and turn out their people. Talk about voter suppression, hello.
Right.
And
Right.
nobody in political science seems to notice this or write about it in any sensible way.
Nobody-
Sorry to rant on the question, but
Nobody in
I
political...
really want to get angry about it.
Nobody in political science wants to draw attention to this because despite all their claims, you know, I'm a recovering political scientist among other things, they like it this way because they think that these organizations are doing what's right. And it goes to the more basic problem, which is the teachers' unions themselves, and the real hope. You know, one thing about the COVID policies is that they've brought home to people just what colossal failures our public schools have been. You've seen the numbers. I mean, you've reported on it, right? I've read your stuff. We know that homeschooling and charter schools are going like gangbusters. They're growing by leaps and bounds, and that's a genuine sign of hope. Yeah, hi.
I've been the president of a condo association.
Oh, God.
I did it as self-defense. It's a matter of self-defense.
That's a good reason to do it. I did that in a homeowners association.
Sometimes the worst oppression is the local oppression. And
Sure.
so how do you deal with that? That sometimes you'd prefer the power be a little further away than your neighbor.
You got to stand up is what you got to do. Let me tell you a story. My homeowners association, back when I lived in Ann Arbor, it was a neo-traditional neighborhood. You know, the garages in back, small lots, everybody, you know, you got community, and everybody made fun of us, but I loved the place. But when I moved in there, you had, because you can't count on social trust any longer, right? The bylaws were this thick, okay? That's because they didn't trust anybody not to have their RV rusting in the front lawn. But you also had some people who went around with notebooks narking on each other, okay? But proof that I lived in a virtuous community. This happened 1 year. And the ladies who did it were very upset because there weren't enough fines handed out. Instead, what was handed out was a new bylaw. You can no longer report on other people anonymously. You must put your name on it. What's more, you're only allowed to do one a month. And the world was safe for garden gnomes once again. You just got to fight it on the ground.
That's a good one to end on.
Okay. Thanks. Thanks, everybody.
Well, thanks so much, Bruce. Really do appreciate that. I do want to recognize, and we'll be here tomorrow, but just so grateful for Ted's wife Dina is here and daughter Elisa. Please raise your hand. Thank you so much for being a part of this, and I know you will be tomorrow in the luncheon panel. This isn't the only way that we have recognized Ted. Tomorrow we'll let you know that we actually have created a small library of Ted's work. We are still using his office as one library, which we invite you to explore, but we've also created another one just down the hall here, which will definitely make you aware of, that has many of his books from his vast collection, which we thought was only on one floor. We came to find out he was actually occupying bookcases on rooms on 2 floors. But suffice it to say, again, Dina and Lisa, thanks so much for being with us here this evening. So this will bring us to the end of tonight's program. Obviously, we still have coffee and refreshments here. You're welcome to that. Some who are not familiar with Pepperdine have expressed their shock that there are not adult beverages available. This is indeed a dry campus, ladies and gentlemen. That's not to say that this is a dry town. Malibu is not. And so if you would like recommendations to continue these conversations down the hill, as we say, more than happy to do that. As you see on the agenda, tomorrow we will kick back off with breakfast right outside here at 8:30, and then we'll get our panels underway with Darren Staloff beginning shortly after 9. I thought I'd conclude just this evening with, and it was some of Bruce's remarks make me think just about Ted's work and this connection between self-governance and what it means to be an American, but also this increasing awareness and how we're coming to see this increasing popular awareness that something's broken in this. And Ted put it so well in a essentially a guiding document called A Way Forward, which was essentially a principles document for an initiative that Ted and I worked on. It involved some of the other people in this room, called the American Project on the Future of Conservatism. And it was one of the hardest things I've ever done professionally. It was initially funded in 2016 with really by some funders that thought that we were going to be experiencing 4 years of President Clinton, and with that there would be the fracturing of a once great political party known as the Republican Party. Of course, one of those things was true. I mean, Clinton obviously did not win, but the Republican Party was still fractured. And in that, we were tasked with trying to pull together conservatives from across the spectrum. And it began with a meeting here on this campus in the spring of 2017. And as I said, both Ted and I were ready for this to degenerate into a simply kind of pro-Trump, anti-Trump shouting match. And thankfully it did not do that, although we had all sides of that question represented. Where it resolved was in a place where we never anticipated, was this general consensus among a group of about 30 or 35 people that America was suffering from this debilitating loneliness. This was what Ted sensed and others. And so over the course of that summer of 2017, I played a slight role in the Committee on Style for this principles document. Ted did most all of the writing. But I just wanted to read these first two paragraphs because I think it speaks to what's at stake if we don't get Ted's thinking right, if we don't take it seriously. Now, if anyone is working in this social science world these days, in 2024, loneliness has become a pretty popular thing. I mean, you've seen it across a variety of disciplines, from public health to social psychology to economics, political science, studies on technology. But in 2017, just essentially months after Trump took office, this was still kind of there weren't many people talking about it. And so in this document, which we titled A Way Forward, which kind of sketched out the possible future direction for the American conservative movement, this is what mostly Ted wrote. This is how it begins. The American political system suffers from a serious but treatable disorder. We see the most obvious symptoms easily enough, ranging from political polarization and radicalization to apathy and civic disengagement, leading many to wonder if we are coming apart. The malady itself is a profound, pervasive alienation where citizens have lost our connections to politics and each other. We are experiencing a modern loneliness so acute as to threaten what we call the American project. The American project represents the distilled core of a long American tradition, and it is the essential common ground of our national understanding, one that invites all into a connective history and a set of rights and responsibilities. With deep roots in Western civilization, the American project is grounded in the conviction that the capacity for self-government is a source of a distinctly human dignity, one that in America produced an exceptional and peculiarly American governing document, the U.S. Constitution. Related, this right and ability to pursue happiness requires energetic social and political institutions, from schools and houses of worship to workplaces and political parties, to supply moral order and to speak to our deep human needs for virtue and belonging. The collapse of these community-building institutions has led directly to a severe questioning of what it means to be an American, with a looming threat of losing any sense of our common American identity. That's what TED was about, right? I mean, his understanding of, dare I say, American human nature, that it required a certain set of institutions to support it, grounded in community. And as we read just this first line, this serious but treatable disorder and this modern loneliness, it seems that this is what we've been experiencing for the better part of the last 8 years, with questions about how much longer is this going to go on. It seems to me that this really should be what we are committed to as a group. If we care and deeply love TED, and I know we all do, and I'm sensing that I'm giving away my closing remarks right now, but I might as well go with what I have on my heart. This seems to me what we should be committed to. This is Ted's baton to us. And again, I'm very grateful to each of you for being here, and for tomorrow. Couldn't be more excited to see the different ways we're going to explore Ted's work. And I was about to say at the end of the day, but Ted hated that phrase. He was so particular about language. Anytime any students would say, well, you know, at the end of the day, what's going, and Ted would say, don't say that, because at the end of the day, there's another day. So in the end, this is what this is about. And it's hard to think about something more important than the future of the American project, something Ted cared so deeply about, and how we create and defend and promote these essential cultural and political institutions that can prepare people who are ready for the hard task of self-governing. So with that, again, we've got refreshments here. Feel free to hang out here or see the beautiful end of the sunset here in Malibu.